Growth means rising incomes, and that means for most people the ability to consume more housing and have better housing. And that's a good thing, but it's somewhat more complex because the gains from growth are so unevenly distributed. We know that for a very long period until the mid-1970s, the economic growth tended to lead to greater equality of incomes and wealth within countries. The last 40 years, that's not been true. So that the gap between rich and poor, whether in terms of wealth and income, is much worse than it was. Now, housing plays into this in two key ways. Obviously, for people who rent homes, when economic growth now takes place, it's often in cities where it's difficult to supply extra housing, so the rent of housing goes up. That means that once you pay your rent, you have less residual income, so your ability to do a whole range of other things is greatly reduced. Your capabilities are reduced. So that you get two effects from that. One is your residual income's lower now. Also, your capability to build a future and build income is also reduced. Some households, of course, because they own rather than rent, they'll have put money into housing and they see the uplift on that, and that makes a very substantial contribution to their wealth position. Funnily enough, it leads to greater equality of wealth distributions because it means more people hold wealth and hold wealth at an earlier age. But it does mean that there's a growing gap over time between those who are owners and those who are renters. So the effects of housing are to basically reduce incomes in the current term, lead to often unearned wealth gains for some, but also change the capabilities of households to actually earn, to learn, for children to grow and develop in ways that makes them effective at school and in work and acquiring skills. That all reduces growth and it reduces their incomes. I think that the biggest gaps are actually not about patterns of poverty or patterns of inequality in wealth, but about how housing affects income growth for individuals. We all know from our daily experiences that, and when we see poorer housing areas and poorer kids, we know that it attenuates their development of skills, their ability to get jobs, the ability of people in most of our disadvantaged areas to reach out into the labour market is really difficult. So that I think it's really very important that we deal with that particular set of issues. I think the second major area I'd like to see is a much more systematic audit of how housing outcomes, whether it's the quality of housing, the location of housing, housing assets, or even just the high costs of housing, how that affects productivity and productivity growth. Because very often Treasury and Finance Ministries will say, well, housing doesn't have any productivity effect on the economy. It's simply a case of a political judgment about should we favour it in terms of redistribution. The reality is it does have a significant productivity effect. There's no research on that in Scotland, and it's a gap we ought to remedy very soon. I would say actually keep working on the framework of inclusive growth. I think it's really important, but articulate how housing fits within that. There has been no coherent framework for thinking about housing economy issues within the Scottish Government. In the 40 years I've been dealing with these issues, even when I worked within government. So I do think that looking at inclusive growth with housing at the core of the issues is really important. In terms of actual policy initiatives, I do think that it's extremely important that we don't think we will deal effectively with the problems of younger people who can't get into home ownership, say people between the ages of 25 and even up to 40 now, spending longer and longer in renting at high rents at a time when mortgage rates are really low. I don't think building more rented housing is the solution, because it means people are going to end up at retirement age in 30 years' time with pretty attenuated assets. I think we've got to think about new paths and new ways into home ownership for younger households, and I think it's possible to do that. The second is for the very poorest households. I congratulate the Scottish Government on their commitment to the affordable rented housing programme and the social rented housing programme they have. I think that should be augmented. I think that housing associations should be at the centre of it, providing not only more affordable rented housing, but actually seeing the fantastic community-based associations we have as a real resource to do integrated change. They can tie to get things together in local neighbourhoods. They can deliver affordable housing. They can think about shaping new routes into different tenures for their younger tenants. I just think we're missing a trick by not emphasising that right now.